Okay, well, thank you very much. I do apologise about having to go, but this is a fabulous event. I'm really pleased to put this event on with the International Observatory for Human Rights, as well as the families who were affected by this particular issue. Saeed and Ahmadreza, I think that the situation that they face and their families face is appalling. These two men have been jailed by the Iranian regime on fabricated charges of trying to undermine the Islamic Republic. They are only two of many people who have been physically and mentally tortured in jail cells in Iran in order to extract false confessions. It is vital that UK politicians, and I'm pleased to be here today, listen to their stories and understand the grave situation. I think we had an opportunity over lunch to discuss the issues, and quite frankly, it's a terrible situation that you face, that your family faces. And I feel for you. There are many political prisoners in Iran, and I suppose events like this raise awareness not just of the two families, but all those who face similar circumstances. Some people have dared to speak out against the theocratic state, and whilst they have been imprisoned unfairly, accept their title as a political prisoner. And they are political prisoners. They're being used by the Iranian regime. There are others, of course, and Saeed and Ahmadreza fall into this category of dual nationals who are caught between their former Iranian citizenship or current Iranian citizenship and their citizenship application in third countries. They're the victim of Iran's desperate diplomacy, as far as I'm concerned, and they should not be used as bargaining chips. You know, we've got the high-profile case of Nazanin Ratcliffe, which I think is appalling and just highlights the way that the Iranian regime treats some of its prisoners, even foreign prisoners. With that, I think I'm going to hand over to Trish. I think we're going to get going. Is it possible that we could get going? So we've got two wonderful sessions, which I think you're going to lead, Trish.
I am indeed.
With some wonderful guest speakers about this really important issue, and I hope that today is is worthwhile and the first step in a number of worthwhile events that highlight the plight of political prisoners in Iran and leads to at least pressure on the Iranian government to act, but also a greater awareness around the world of the way that the Iranian regime are treating these people. I only hope that it does bring about change. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. I know you have to leave very briefly, but hopefully we have Graham back later, maybe for some questions, depending if he gets a good result with Jeremy Corbyn. However, I'd like to introduce myself. I'm Valerie Piet. I'm the director of the International Observatory of Human Rights. It is a great pleasure of mine to bring together people who've come from all over the world to really raise awareness of what's happening in Iran today and to let us really understand what are the voices that we should be hearing from Iran. Saeed has been in prison for 10 years. We'll speak to Vida, hopefully, who had a problem with her visa, but Vida is going to be Skyped in with us so she can still share her story and that of her husband, who now faces the death sentence. The second panel, I'm very delighted to welcome a group of people who have been championing for the rights of BBC. So we have Maryam Malekpour here, we have Caelan Gallagher from Doughty Street Chambers, and from Oslo we have Dr. Mahmoud, who's come to represent human rights and really to share some stories of some other cases as well. But in this week, where we've got the Commonwealth have come to the UK, all of the countries have been gathered together, I think it's a very strong time for us to stand up and say that we mustn't forget that there are people still incarcerated and there's a job still to do with Iran to actually stand up for their own citizens and their own citizens' charters.
Apologies for the slight delay, but we're very delighted to have you with us. Now, as Valerie said, the first session today is going to look at dual nationals and their particular plight. And we're very lucky to have with us on the panel today people who know exactly what it's like to be tortured, to be unjustly arrested, to be forced into giving a false confession, and to languish for years in a foreign prison. I'd like to introduce my guests, please. Vida Mehrannia, who will be joining us hopefully via Skype. Now, she is an Iranian biochemist from Uppsala University. She's also the wife of Ahmadreza Djalali, the Swedish-Iranian academic who has been detained since April 2016 and has been given a death sentence. She has 2 children and she's currently living in Stockholm. Then we have Shiva Mahbobi, who has just joined us. She is a former Iranian political prisoner who is best known as a spokesperson for the Campaign to Free Political Prisoners in Iran. She has also campaigned to establish June the 20th as the International Day of Action to support political prisoners in Iran. She was a women's and students' rights activist in Iran when she was deemed by the Islamic regime to be an enemy of the God. She was arrested, tortured, and imprisoned for more than 3 years, all at the age of 16. She now continues her political activities after her release, but she had to leave the country for fear of being rearrested or executed. And finally, we have Maryam Malekpour. She is the Iranian-Canadian dual national whose life was literally turned upside down 10 years ago following the imprisonment of her brother Saeed on fabricated charges in 2008. She had to flee to Vancouver in 2012 when she discovered that the Iranian authorities were trying to arrest her for bringing Saeed's case to the public. For the past decade, she has campaigned tirelessly for his release. Shiva, if I could start with you, please. I think it's important to mention and to talk about your incarceration. When you were 16, you were tortured and you spent 3 years in prison. Can you tell us what that period of your life was like, what that experience was like, and do you feel that that's influenced the work that you do today?
Yeah. First of all, I'm really sorry that I'm late. I'm usually on time. There was a huge demonstration in the Parliament Square. So, yes, thank you for having me here. I think it's a great opportunity to talk about generally political prisoner. And I think as someone who would never imagined one day I'm going to be here and speak with you guys about what was happening in prison. Unfortunately, many of my cellmates or even classmates at the time, aged 13 and 14, they're not here to speak with you. So I guess it's kind of, I see it as a duty to talk about what happened. I'm not going through details just because of the time, but yes, I was, if you could imagine right now in Parliament Square, they're distributing flyers, they're talking about a dictatorship and talking about people being suffering. That's what exactly I did, nothing else whatsoever. And that was regarding a compulsory Islamic hijab, regarding my classmates disappearing and being kidnapped, being imprisoned, being tortured, and being executed. Only, trust me, only 13, age of 13 and 14. So that's all I was doing when I was arrested. And I was told that I'm the enemy of the God. And so-called judge, which was really ridiculous. It was just a room with mullah and 2 guards sitting there and telling me that, do you know what you did? Actually, you deserve to be executed. I wasn't allowed to talk. There were no legal representative, nothing whatsoever. Literally, the list was the distributing flyer, helping enemy, you know, being in demonstration and all that kind of stuff. And for that, I was told that, well, your sentence is execution, but we're very kind. We're going to give you just 2.5 years. At the time, I was already in prison for, I think, more than 10 months, which they didn't count. So basically, at that time, I mean, I always say that, you know, sweet 16 and 18 years old, it's a really, really important time of your life. But I guess for me, it was a time that you would be fearful all the time, not just for your life and for family. So I'm really glad you're here and knowing that what actually family going through, my mom coming and not being allowed to visit me. In fact, to put more pressure, not just keeping you in solitary confinement, I think at once, because I've been moved to many prisons, they thought that if you're young, you're going to be influenced and you're going to cooperate with them. So literally, I was moved to 7 or 8 different prisons in different cities, including Evin prison. And so basically, being deprived of, literally, if I give you an example, I had kind of some skin condition, which is very common in prison. And I was told that we're not going to give you any medication. And that's it. You had no voice, you couldn't say anything. And at the time, there were an internet, remember. Now we are in contact with families of political prison and the prisoners, actually. But at the time, we had no way of actually saying what's happening in prison. And when I was in the prison, I mean, at once I was in, so just to give you, I don't want to take so much time, just 7 months. Imagine, I feel sorry for that girl, which was me and many like myself. I mean, imagine a 17 years old being put in solitary confinement for 7 months, solidly 7 months. That means it's a very, very small room. In the winter, you are really shaking because of cold. In the summer, it's so hot and unbearable. Each time at night, you just imagine that any guard may come and rape you. Luckily, it didn't happen to me. Yes, there was sexual harassment, but not that. But every night, I remember I would put all my stuff, which was nothing really, behind the door, and to just keep it if they come through, so I know. Because I have seen in Oromia prison how 3 female political prisoners were mentally disturbed, and these were really intellectual young people before coming to prison. So I guess that one, punishment like beating you up, tying you to a bed and flogging you, and as well as basically arresting your family member in the other room while you're hearing them, they saying that, well, if you don't say this and this, we're gonna arrest them. I mean, in terms of food, in terms of, I spent actually in one of the prison, it's funny, you kind of get used to those memories. In one of the prison, which was Kamiaram prison, I was in a cell for 1 month, which completely dark. I mean, when they would bring me food, I could only smell it actually to know what is that. I'm really sorry. I'm very aware that, like Saeed is in prison, and obviously, but what I mean by that, this is just a drop in an ocean, and what many people been through. I mean, what I've been through is nothing compared to other people been through. Unfortunately, that's how we have to look at it. But I'm saying, multiply this by thousands, hundreds of thousands during the last 39 years, worse than what happened to me. Rape, mock executions, very bad tortures, and all this. So therefore, this is just an image of what could happen to someone in prison, in brief.
Many people believed that after the Iran nuclear deal that relations between the West and Iran would improve significantly. As we know, sadly, that hasn't been the case. And we have access to a frightening research document which shows that in the past 2 years, 30 dual nationals are currently behind bars, which is a higher number than we have ever had before. Tell me what you know about the high-profile case of Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe and Ahmadreza Djalali.
Yeah, so basically, yes, you're right. I mean, I actually was going through the list of dual nationals, and it was interesting because it's always connected to what's going on in Iran. For 2015, 2016, most of the arrests were at that time, actually. And I think Nazanin was, which I am in contact with Richard, and we are following the case and working on it as well. I think Nazanin, like many people, went there to visit, basically, nothing else. But what they do, it depends which country you are from, and you have the residency from. And if you notice, there are specific countries that they get arrested when they go to Iran. And at the same time, I mean, going there, coming back to UK, taking away your child. I think we keep talking about Nazanin, but Gabriella gonna be the most affected, the little girl. And she is never, ever gonna kind of heal from that situation. I mean, Nazanin is a very good example of someone who actually, she's not political, she's not a member of the party. As far as I know, I mean, she hasn't done nothing against even the government. The charge is that throwing the government, I mean, how can she do that, visiting the family? And therefore, I mean, she is still in prison. And the fact that they told the family that she is going to be released soon, but then they changed their mind. Obviously, as you know, Boris Johnson talked about it, and it was on the news heavily. And so therefore, I guess, right now, she is in prison. And believe me, they might even sentence her to execution. It doesn't go like that in Iran. You don't have just 1 year and that you say that I'm going to finish that year and I'm going to be free. So we don't know. According to the news we have, because we're in contact with, we have news basically from her cellmate and all that. She was in a very difficult situation emotionally, especially for she's thought that she's not going to see her daughter anymore. So extremely, it's a nightmare. Every day she wakes up, and that's what she actually said. Every day she wakes up and she's feeling like this is a nightmare. And I just want to, before talking about Ahmadreza Djalali, it's just one more thing that you guys don't know, perhaps, sorry for saying that, it's Roya Sabari Najat, another dual citizen, which is not on the news, from Manchester. She was on the news in 2014, and we campaigned actually for her. And she is the one who was arrested because of Facebook, putting comment on Facebook, and she was sentenced to 20 years in prison and then reduced to 7 years. Just 1 year ago, she was released, but she is not allowed to leave the country for 2 years. What I'm trying to say, and she is in the most vulnerable position in terms of physically and emotionally and mentally. They literally destroyed all her family. And what I'm trying to say, yes, we have a list that people are on the news, but there are some people they're not actually, and we don't know about it, which is dangerous. In terms of Djalali, I think that's a really obvious violation of anything. You invite a person to come and teach in a university, and he has been there several times actually. This is not the first time. But why this time? The question is why this time? And it's really sad. Let me tell you, yesterday, the person from Rouhani's ministry went to Sweden just yesterday. They had a meeting in terms of improving the relationship between Iran and there, and there were no talk of Ahmadreza at all. I personally had a meeting with the foreign minister of Swedish government, and we went there last year. We talked to them. They were even refusing to give us any information. They were just saying that we're working on it. And here we see that nothing is actually happening, and he might be executed anytime. There is no guarantee. I mean, I can go on more, so I'll leave you to ask a question, because trust, there are many cases that I think it's worth mentioning it.
Now, we've known for some time that the Iranian cyber police, they police cyberspace, and people are arrested on the basis of what they do on social media. Tell me what you know about the case of Saeed Malekpour, and we'll be coming to his sister Maryam just in a moment, but if I could just get you to give me an overview first, please.
I think Saeed, we have actually worked a lot on Saeed's case from the very beginning, and perhaps the international pressure was one of the things that his case, his execution sentence was reduced to prison. Well, I guess when you're saying that, that's another thing they accuse Saeed of, that this is what he did just because he was in computer field. That's it. Nothing else whatsoever. And we all knew that that's what's happening. But I guess my view is Saeed's case is unfortunately one of the cases that didn't continue to get attention. And I think one of the things that at the time, if you remember, Hamid Qasem Ishal got another Canadian Iranian got released, but Saeed didn't, whereas both of them had execution sentence. So it's a different complication. I mean, of course, Maryam knows more. And I guess one thing I wanted to say, I really appreciate Maryam is here and Vida is talking about Djalali, because when you're in prison, what do you want? You want other people to be your voice, and especially your family. When you know your family are sitting and talking about you to the world, it's very important, because, of course, you would hear Maryam different than me. I'm a campaigner, but Maryam is part of that family that every minute she suffers when she remembers her brother is in prison. Just leave it at that, yeah.
Maryam, you know better than most what it's like to grieve for your brother who's been in prison for 10 years. You yourself had to leave Canada for fear of being arrested. Tell me what the past 10 years have been like, and if you could mention the appeal and how it was reduced, the death sentence was reduced. Tell me how your campaigning helped this.
My brother has been in prison for 10 years now. He was in solitary confinement for 5 years, and he was brutally tortured mentally and physically. So I started started like doing this campaign when I was in Iran. With the help of Canadian government and other countries, we could commute his death sentence to life in prison. But he's still in prison, and like life in prison is like he's dying slowly, and I don't want this to happen. So what? I have no idea why he is still in prison. The only thing my family want is him to release soon.
At the time of his arrest, he was a permanent resident in Canada and he was very close to getting his Canadian citizenship. Tell me what the Canadian administration have been doing to help Saeed's case.
Saeed was a permanent resident and he was on the path to be a Canadian citizen. At the time of Conservative Party, they helped in Saeed's case a lot. Like they mentioned his name all the time. They helped me with the campaign, and like they had like a statement and they adopted Saeed as a Canadian citizen. But I'm very disappointed with Liberal government because I started writing letters to them, but like all my letters has gone with no response, and then they always bring up this that Saeed is a permanent resident, not a Canadian citizen. We cannot do much. What I want from them, because they started to do the negotiation with Iran to reopen their relationship with Iranian government. I want them to bring Saeed's story up and make him as a part of a deal, because they're gonna have a deal with Iranian government for sure. I don't know what's going on behind the scene. I don't want to know the details. I'm not a political person. I just want them to consider my brother's situation. I don't want him to die. I'm saying again, I don't want him to die in prison. And Canadian government, they are our only hope at the moment.
In a letter that your brother wrote to you, he said that he was brutally tortured into confessing to a crime that he didn't commit. This false confession was then filmed and played on Iranian TV. Tell me what it felt like for you and your family to see this.
The day that they showed my brother's confession on television, it was the first day of our New Year, and it was my dad's funeral, and they showed this. We saw Saeed on the TV, and he was saying awful things against himself. We couldn't believe that it's our Saeed. He's a really caring man, such a nice guy. Never hurt anyone. Everybody just said good things about him, and he was saying terrible things against him. And when I heard that, and my mom got a heart attack that night. My brother and I, we couldn't move. We were shaking. So it was a time that I realized it's gonna be a danger for Saeed, and they're gonna sentence him to death, because it's the way that they always do. They always make confession, they always torture people to force them to confess against themselves, and then after that they show it on the TV, and after that they kill them. So I started doing campaign non-stop from them.
Shiva, as we just heard, reports of torture are unfortunately widespread. Tell me what you know about the Canadian photojournalist Sarah Kazemi, who died under torture, and the very well documented case of Naga Aga Sultan, who was a young protester who was shot dead in broad daylight in 2009. And I know this is a cause very close to your heart, isn't it?
Yeah. I guess Zahra Kazemi, who was actually killed in prison in 2003, she was almost the first one as a dual citizen at the time. That was all she did, was going around Evin prison. She was a photojournalist, taking photos and all that, and they arrested her, they tortured her, and they said that she died because of stroke, which was even later on they had to confess that there was evidence of bruises and the damages that happened to her under the torture. And I guess her case is one of the examples that at the time, of course, they weren't so common to arrest dual citizens. So, but after that, her son campaigned specifically for her, and even Canadian government, maybe that's the time they started taking action regarding that. Nothing happened after that. I mean, regime didn't take any responsibility. Here and there talked about it. But at the same time, I think this is quite relevant also, if I may mention before, Neda Zahra Bahrami, another dual citizen from Netherlands. She was also executed in 2009 when Neda al-Sultan was shot. And she was the one who actually was in prison. We knew she's going to be executed any time. Our campaign, myself, wrote to the Dutch government so many times, telling that we do now, we have information that basically we were told if there is no protest for her, she's going to be executed, and that's what exactly happened. But they did too little too late. They just postponed it. When you say what the Canadian government did, the Dutch government postponed it. Yes, they kind of cut the political time with the Iranian embassy at the time, but they didn't do that much really. So it's same as, I think, when they saw Neda al-Sultan on the TV, they should have known what is happening to someone like Zahra Bahrami and many others. So unfortunately, I would say they failed quite badly, and I would love to talk about the British government who really, really failed. Nazanin, who failed, Kamal Foroughi, who failed, Roya Sabari-Nejad. If I may just mention that, I think this is one aspect. See, dual citizen has some vulnerability because they are from another, they can be called spy, which all of them, apparently, they have a label. And but at the same time, they have a very good advantage. And the advantage is that apart from their family and protests in Iran, they have a government, if they act on it, to save them. That's a huge advantage for this dual citizen. But didn't happen. I mean, literally, they let this family so down that the husband of Roya Sabari-Nejad once said, the only time I'll come on the media and talk about Roya if David Cameron at the time will come and see it and tell me why they're not doing anything.
What you're seeing behind us is trying to patch Vida in from Stockholm. So she's joining us by Skype, but she will be in London hopefully by next week. So if anybody wanted to speak to Vida in person, then we'll be able to arrange that next week. But I'm hoping, if we're lucky,
I think we have her back.
Technology.
Hello, Vida. Hi there. Can you hear us? Yes. Good to have you with us. Thank you for being with us. Now, you are the wife of... Oh, sorry. Shiva, if perhaps I can just continue with you. Do you think that Trump's decertifying of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action will have a negative impact on American Iranians currently incarcerated?
Well, to be honest, I think nuclear agreement had nothing to do with people, had nothing to do. So even not having or having it is exactly the same. So I don't think, I know they said it in media, but even nuclear agreement kind of actually silenced what's going on. I had a meeting with European Union, and when we were asking, what do you do about political prisoners, they really clearly told us that we're not going to jeopardize our... So what Trump does or does not, which most of the time doesn't make sense anyway, but it doesn't really impact that. I think, Jason Rezai, the other dual citizen from America, they got released because they paid the Iranian regime. That's the only reason. So I think it needs very concrete, systematic action from the government who say that, well, actually, you are my citizen and I'm going to act on that.
Hi, can you hear me now?
Yes.
You're the wife of Ahmadreza Djalali. He regularly visited Iran for many years. I think he'd been there as many as 7 times for scientific conferences and workshops. But then in April 2016, he was arrested. He was in solitary confinement for 3 months. It was 7 months before he was allowed access to a lawyer. Why do you think your husband was detained and given the death sentence?
I think he was sacrificing because his innocent academic, and I think for political and security and financial gains, they arrested him. No.
Tell me how he is, because he's been on hunger strike twice. He's been in solitary confinement for an extended period of time. What's his mental and physical well-being like? How is he?
They threatened a lot of time by his family in Sweden, and also they threatened him by a death penalty. And several times before he's going to trial, they threatened him will execute you. And he was under a lot of pressure and threatened and started hunger strike 2 times for a long time, 44 days and 43 days. And he lost a lot of weight after stopped hunger strike. He was very sick. He had a lot of health problems.
Now, Saeed Malekpour was also given a death sentence, but in 2013 his death sentence was commuted to life imprisonment. Are you hoping that the Iranian government will do something similar for you, or better still, a full pardon?
I hope that they change his sentence because he's completely innocent, and change his sentence and review his case. If review his case, they understand he will innocent, and change his sentence, and maybe just 2 years is enough for him. At the moment, they can release. But we asked several times from Iranian government, also from European government, and also Sweden can ask the Iranian authority for review his case.
Now, you and Ahmadreza have 2 young children. You have a 15-year-old daughter and a 6-year-old son. What do they think about the plight of their father, and how do you manage to keep the family positive?
It's so difficult because my daughter is under emotional pressure, but my daughter knows about his dad and his situation. It's difficult for her also. But for my son, he is 6 years old, and it's so difficult for him. He doesn't understand anything about his dad's situation, and every day ask why he's not come back to Sweden, and just I can say he's working. I cannot explain what happened for his dad. It's so difficult for me, and he wants to see his dad, and he wants to talk with his dad and say, please open camera, I can see him. But for 2 years we couldn't see him also.
Very difficult situation. Thank you, Vida. Shiva, if I could just come back to you, please. Tell me what the significance of the 20th of June is.
Well, 20th of June, we felt like there were lots of campaign protests and in support of political prisoners in Iran, and I guess our campaign, CFPPI, decided to say, well, maybe there should be a day that is specifically talking about all political prisoners, regardless where they are from and all that, in Iran specifically. So I guess it's important because since 2011, we've been celebrating it, we've been having conferences, making awareness regarding what's going on, and it's important because for one day, draw people's attention to what's happening. Unfortunately, so much happening in the world, in Syria, in other places, that it's so difficult to focus on one. And I guess we felt that it is important, like, it's been 4 decades almost, unbelievable that thousands of people have been arrested, executed, and etc. So it's important to let people know what's going on. And on that day, usually we have a theme for that, either about families of political prisoners, 1 year about children of political prisoners, and also the medical deprivation in prison. So I think it's quite important to participate in that. Usually International Days is an occasion that people pay attention once more to see what we're going to do about a fellow human being who's been tortured in another country.
Well, we wish you luck with the 20th of June. Ladies and gentlemen, this is our first panel. I'd like to thank our panel. I'd like to thank Vida joining us from Sky. Thank you, Vida Mehrannia. Thank you. Shiva Mahbobi and Maryam Malekpour. Thank you very much. The second panel discussion that we have today, while we're trying to get all this running, is going to highlight the plight of civil society activists and human rights defenders fighting for international reform in Iran. Now, they will identify the major issues faced by human rights lawyers when dealing with the Iranian judiciary system, which, as we know, can be very complicated. And we will talk about how international law can be utilised to combat human rights violations within the country. Our panel today is Rana Rahimpour, and she is a British-Iranian journalist who works for the BBC World Service. She is a news presenter and reporter with the BBC Persian TV, and she's anchored and covered many Iranian and international stories for the network, including the Iran nuclear program, the Iran's presidential election in 2009 and its aftermath, both for BBC Persian TV and BBC World Service, and also the Iranian presidential election in 2013. We also have Keelan Gallagher, QC. She is a barrister at Doughty Street Chambers, specialising in human rights, public law and media law. She has acted in many landmark human rights cases in the UK in recent years, including acting for the survivors and bereaved families of the 7/7 London bombings, as well as the Hillsborough disaster. Much of her work is for journalists, media organisations, bloggers and human rights activists detained by states due to their work. In 2017, she was made a Fellow of the Royal Society of Arts for her contribution to the protection of human rights. And the third member on the panel is Dr. Mahmoud Amiri Mokadem, and he's a Norwegian-Iranian neuroscientist and a human rights activist. He is currently the head of the Laboratory of Molecular, bit of a mouthful, neuroscience and professor at the medical facility at the University of Oslo in Norway. He is a well-known defender of human rights, and he received the Amnesty International Human Rights Prize in 2007 for his work against human rights violations in Iran. He is the founder and director of the NGO Iran Human Rights, which monitors the violations of human rights with a focus on the death penalty in Iran, and he works to empower the civil society inside Iran. If I can now ask our panel, Rana, if I can ask you to please do your presentation, that would be lovely.
Sure. Hi, everyone. Compared to many stories that we had earlier, perhaps our story is more bearable, and I don't think I should be on the same panel as some of the ladies you heard earlier, but it's also another violation of human rights committed by the Iranian government. So I joined the BBC Persian service in 2008, for which I moved from Iran to the UK. To me, it was an easy decision. I think most journalists would dream about working for one of the most reputable news organizations in the world. More importantly, I wanted to be able to report freely, without being censored, without being told what to write and what not to write, without being worried about arrest or punishment, or possible risks to my family. But little did I know that the Iranian authorities won't leave me alone, even when I'm outside the country. The intimidation started in 2009, soon after the disputed presidential election, which we covered like any other stories in the BBC. But the Iranian authorities started to systematically harass us. The list is long. Many relatives were called in for interrogations, from 90-year-old fathers to 10-year-old sisters. They were threatened that they would lose their jobs, pensions, right to travel, or that their child might be accidentally killed in London. The authorities wanted to threaten us. Although we weren't in Iran, they wanted to show us that they still have power over us. My case unfolded in 2013. I called my elderly father on his mobile phone, but he immediately asked me to call him on my uncle's landline. And I instantly knew that something was up. My father didn't want to speak on his own number because he was worried that it might be bugged. He said he had been interrogated for hours. They wanted to know about me and my husband. They wanted my address and my phone number. They threatened that if I didn't give up my job, there would be consequences. And there were. 5 months later, as he was about to board a flight to London to come and visit my newborn child, his passport was confiscated. My mother's passport was also confiscated 2 weeks later upon her return to Iran. For months, I didn't know whether I would ever get to see them again. I couldn't go home and they couldn't leave. For months, we didn't know how long our nightmare was going to last. We spent most of that year in front of Skype. Every time I hung up, I ran to my bedroom away from my little child to cry. Finally, my parents managed to get an appointment with the judge. In fact, the judge said he watched BBC Persian and that he thought I'm a good reporter, but that my parents had to stop me. My father said Rana never listened to me when she was a teenager. There's no way she would listen to me now. And the judge said, you raised her, you can stop her. Obviously, it didn't happen. It was then that we found out that the travel ban was going to last for 1 year. Of course, I couldn't believe it until I actually saw them at the airport here in London. And this chapter of my life had a relative happy ending. Sadly, it hasn't been true for many of my colleagues. In one case, a mother was diagnosed with cancer and her condition deteriorated so quickly that she was unable to travel to a third country to visit her son. She died in front of Skype. She raised my colleague as a single mother. He wasn't even able to carry her coffin. In another case, a father had a stroke and developed dementia. He couldn't understand why his favorite daughter didn't go to visit him. Every time my colleague phoned, her father asked, when are you coming? I miss you. Every time a parent dies, we get together in London and hold a service in the memory of our colleague's loved one in Iran. We do this to offer support to a friend facing their painful loss simply because it's too dangerous to go home and mourn with those gathered around the grave. I personally fall into depression every time a colleague loses a loved one. I know one day, sooner or later, it will be my turn. More recently, the asset freeze has created trouble for many of my colleagues. It effectively freezes inheritance for their entire family. No one can buy or sell any assets connected to a BBC Persian named member of staff. This punishment is far-reaching. It's having a devastating effect on our brothers, our sisters, and our wider families. The guilt we feel about the difficulties we have created for our relatives is difficult to describe. My colleagues and I want our lives back. We want to be able to do our job without fear. My colleagues and I shouldn't have to report threats to the police or look over our shoulders in London. We want to be able to return to our country safely and to see our families. We want to be able to do all the things you take for granted. Visit our parents, see our aunts and uncles, go to family weddings and to family funerals. We want to be able to visit our sick relatives. I want my child to be able to see her country and to visit her grandparents and to know her Iranian heritage. We don't want our families to suffer because of our choice of profession and just because we work for the BBC. The asset freeze is preventing many of our family members from benefiting from their lifetime of hard work and from passing it on to their children. This is an unacceptable sanction because of our work as journalists. This is not just about our fundamental rights and those of our families. This is about the right to freedom of speech. It's about the right of Iranian citizens and the international community to receive objective and impartial information about current events in Iran as well as events around the world, free from the influence of the authorities. This abuse must come to an end. Journalism is not a crime. Thank you.
Thank you, Rana. If I can now pass it over to you, Keelan.
Thank you very much. So I'm a lawyer, as was said, and amongst my clients currently are the 152 BBC Persian journalists who are affected by the measures that Ran has spoken about. Now, journalists, and there's many of you in the room, are obviously used to impartially and objectively telling others' stories and reporting the news. And the position that Rana and her colleagues have been put in, and indeed many other journalists have been put in who operate within Iran or report on Iran, is that they've had a horrific experience themselves and they've been placed in a position of having to become the story, having to tell their own story. And put very simply, this is the way it's put by Jeremy Deere from the International Federation of Journalists. Journalists want to report the news, not be the news. And Rana has been forced into a position where she's become the news rather than reporting on the very many stories from Iran, which she's been doing so well for years. And we heard earlier in the first panel the very powerful stories, voices from people who are affected by detention, arbitrary detention and horrific imprisonment conditions within Iran. But ensuring that those voices are heard and those stories are told, a critical part of that is the work that Rana and her colleagues and other of you in the room who are journalists do. And I think I may have to stand up to use the PowerPoint, will I? Yeah, okay. Excuse me, slight change just for a moment. Can I do this? Thank you. Now, Rana's story is just one of many, and I hope the technical equipment does work this time. And there's a few more examples of individuals, and these are quotes which were gathered by the National Union of Journalists. Sarah Kavanagh from the National Union of Journalists is here. So these are other examples of BBC Persian journalists who are affected. So they arrested my loved ones to force me to leave my job because I'm a BBC Persian journalist. I couldn't be with my mum in her last days because I'm a BBC Persian journalist. These are all words from colleagues of Rana's. Or the Iranian cyber army, which we heard about earlier, has been trying to hack me because I'm a BBC Persian journalist. And they are examples of the effect of what Iran is doing to BBC Persian. And we think this is the canary in the coal mine and is likely to affect other journalists and is starting to affect other journalists and other media organisations. Just so you know a little bit about the background about what's happened to BBC Persian over the last year in particular. Last summer, we discovered that there was a court order, an asset freezing injunction issued by the Iranian authorities, which lists 152 current and former BBC Persian staff and contributors, freezes their assets, prevents them from renting, selling or inheriting property. Now, the BBC weren't told about this. The affected individuals, like Rana, weren't told about this. It was only discovered, Handmaid's Tale style, when a particular individual tried to conduct a property transaction and realised that their assets were frozen. Now, after that, it turned out that this asset freeze was just the tip of the iceberg, and it was actually linked to an underlying criminal investigation into BBC Persian staff on allegations of conspiracy to commit a crime against national security in Iran and abroad. So charges, allegations along the lines of those which have so many people detained for decades and subject to death sentences in Iran currently. The injunction has been in place since then, was initially due to only be in place until December, but has continued past at that time. And it was discovered by accident. It was stumbled across in this way. Now, many of those affected have been in a position where they're based in London, so they are mainly UK and Iran nationals who are based in London. They're here, they do their work here because they've been unable to return to Iran since 2009 when there was an escalation of harassment against them there. But a critical issue for them is the combination of repressive measures and threats by the authorities against them, but also against their families. And many of them, as you've heard from Rana, have had a situation where pressure is placed on their families in Tehran in order to try to stop them doing their work here. And that's done in many ways. And we did a survey of BBC Persian staff, and for many of them, these stories have to be anonymous. So we gathered this anonymized data that gives you a sense of the range of ways in which there are attempts to silence them. So this was a staff survey in October 2017, and of 96 journalists, you can see the figures there. So just to pick out a number of them, 45 of them have had their parents questioned or interrogated by the authorities. So they've got family in Iran, their family members are hauled in. So 45 parents, 40 brothers or sisters. So about half of them have had that experience. And some of the experiences are horrendous. Some of them involve family member being hauled in, and then there being a connection made via Skype to the journalist and pressure being put on the journalist in London, either to spy for the regime or to stop doing their job. You'll see a number of them jailed. You'll see there 34 of them lost elderly parents and were unable to see them before they died. And some of you may have seen a very powerful story in the Times a number of months ago about precisely that. So individuals having to see their loved one die via a smuggled in mobile phone to a hospital and not being able to actually communicate with them, hug them, see them, because their families are trapped in Iran and they are trapped here, and these measures are being taken to pressurise both of them. And also there's some, it may seem much more low level, and of course it's very low level compared to what we've heard about today, but is really pernicious. You can see 58 attacked in social media with false and defamatory allegations, and much of that is very gendered. So Rana and many of the other female presenters have been in a position where allegations are made, there's fake news suggesting that they are of dubious character, and that's spread very widely, and it's used again as a means to try and silence them. And that is all part and parcel of the same picture. So Rana mentioned the importance of freedom of expression, and freedom of expression is, of course, one of the most important principles in a free society, and really critical so that we can hear the powerful stories we heard during session one. And it's in constant battle with oppressive governments who seek to control the flow of information and silence their critics. Now, many of you will know about the high-profile cases which show that being a journalist in Iran is a high-risk role. So Maziar Bahari, for example, when a reporter for Newsweek was jailed in Evin prison in 2009, charged with multiple counts of espionage, forced to provide a televised confession that Western journalists in general worked as spies. You heard earlier from Maryam about Saeed's forced confession. That's a routine technique which is used. Or Jason Rezaian, who was mentioned earlier, the Washington Post reporter, whose Tehran home was raided in 2014. He and his wife arrested. Jason detained for 1.5 years, again charged with espionage and propaganda against the establishment. He was ultimately convicted in a closed-door trial in 2015, and as you heard, got out essentially as part of a deal, an international deal in 2016. So those tactics of harassing journalists, accusing them of espionage simply for doing their jobs are not new tactics. But it seems to us, working on the BBC Persian case, that there are 3 things which make this particularly pernicious and a matter of very serious concern for all of us in the room. Firstly, it's an unprecedented collective punishment of journalists. The injunction names 152 people simply because of a connection with one international media organisation. It is a jurisprudential dragnet capturing all in its path. Secondly, it's also a collective punishment of those connected to the journalists, their family members, and also, we've seen this recently in relation to Deutsche Welle, the German media organisation, their sources, where a piece of journalism published by Deutsche Welle internationally, where their source was a professor in Tehran, the professor in Tehran has now been prosecuted and convicted and has been jailed because of his work providing information, objective, impartial, to a media organisation internationally. And that's a means of targeting him and chilling sources within Iran. It's also a means of targeting the reporters outside who are trying to tell these vital stories and shine a light on what we've been hearing through these 2 panels. Also, Rana's touched on some of the other ways in which this collective punishment of those connected to journalists. Family members that we work with have passports confiscated. They're subject to travel bans, so they can't travel to see their family members, and they're harassed, all in an effort to silence their relatives. And thirdly, it's cross-border. So no longer is Iran targeting those who report or criticise it on its own soil. It's using the long arm of the state to reach out across borders, to reach out here to the UK, to reach out internationally, to attempt to silence journalists like Rana, based in the UK, because of what they are reporting about Iran, what they are reporting in Europe about Iran. And it's leveraging the fact that they have loved ones within Iran to exert pressure upon journalists outside. And as well as those particular examples, there are many other ways in which Iran is trying to silence media internationally. So you've got the Deutsche Welle example about sources. Many of you will also know about the efforts to jam satellite signals, blocking foreign media entering Iran. So again, that's an effort to silence people internationally, but it's also to stop people in Iran hearing these stories, hearing objective, impartial reporting, and being given information to make decisions themselves. So the critical question is what we can do about it, as far as we're concerned. That's a key thing. Now, many people earlier spoke about international pressure and the importance of it. And Shiva mentioned dual nationals and the fact that dual nationals have a particularly powerful position because they may have a foreign government advocating for them. And Maryam, you were critical of the lack of action currently by the Canadian government. Most of that 152 individuals, the vast, vast majority of them are UK nationals and they're Londoners. They're here. They're here in London, they have MPs here, they have a government here, they have a foreign secretary here, and they are entitled to be heard and to take their case here and to ensure that pressure is put by the UK government on Iran to stop what's happening to them here internationally and to stop what's happening to their families within Iran. They're also, for the time being, I won't mention the word Brexit for too long, but they do have MEPs here. They've got representation in the European Parliament, and the European Parliament can be a very powerful tool when it comes to negotiating with Iran. It has been powerful in other cases. And also critically, and this is also something, of course, open to Maryam and many others, they can use the international mechanisms by going to the United Nations. And the United Nations does have a range of ways in which you can have your story told. Now, I'm not going to go into the detail because of the time, but I just wanted to give you a very quick summary of the steps that have been taken. So working with BBC Persian and working with the National Union of Journalists and the International Federation of Journalists, we have an international campaign for the people who are affected by this. And a particular part of that has been an appeal to the UN. And we've appealed to the Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Expression, David Kay, that's him there, and also the late Asma Jahangir, the Special Rapporteur on Iran. And we filed a complaint, including that anonymised data, in October 2017, and we got within days an extremely powerful joint statement by David Kay and Asma Jahangir urging the authorities to cease all legal action against BBC Persian staff and their families, stop using repressive legislation against independent journalism, whether affiliated to the BBC or not. And since then, we've also had a statement of support from the UN Secretary General, and Rana has spoken along with colleagues, Kazra Naji and others, in Geneva, and we've had the UK's ambassador in Geneva speaking out. So there is an international campaign too, and I think an important thing for us to discuss when this is open to the floor and when we're talking about all the cases, including the cases in the first panel, is how we can leverage international support and how we can best use that platform. And for those of you in the room who are journalists, who are on social media, telling these stories is critical, because unless we make noise and shout from the rooftops, we are not going to get change, and we are not going to protect Rana and her colleagues, their families in Iran, and the other families in Iran who are affected in the horrific way that we heard earlier. So I hope that's enough to start with before we move on to questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Keelan. If I can now ask Dr. Mahmoud Amory McAdam to take to the podium, please.
Yeah, I think I just go straight over. So I would like to thank the International Observatory of Human Rights for organizing this meeting. I really love your slogan, putting human rights into focus. Because unfortunately, human rights is not, doesn't have a high priority in the international politics. As we know, it's mainly security or financial issues which do have the high priority, but I believe that sustainable peace and stability is not possible as long as we do not take into account people of those countries and their rights. So that's why if we think long term, if we want sustainable peace, we need to put human rights on the agenda. And there is no, it's not automatically so that when the diplomatic relations are improved, human rights situation will get improved. We saw that during the nuclear deal. Since 2013, the relationship between Iran and the Western governments have been improved, and it has never been as good as it has been in the previous years. And still we see that among the darkest years when it comes to the human rights, we can look at, for example, 2015. We had the highest number of executions in the last 20 years, and also many of these people with dual citizenship, they were arrested actually in these years. So we need to put human rights on top of the agenda in any talk between Iran and Western governments. So my name is Mahmoud Amiri Mogaddam. I represent Iran Human Rights, and our main focus has been the death penalty for the last 13 years. And here you see our website and our social media. IranHR.net. If you go to the IranHR.net and see what happens during what has happened during the past few days, you see on our social media for a couple of days ago a mother calling for a halt in her son's execution. And we also see that the execution was stopped yesterday. But unfortunately, today we see that her son, Bahman Varmezyar, was executed this morning. And on our social media, you see the mother burying her son. We also see on our website our annual report on the death penalty. I hope that you can have time and go and visit this report. In this report, you can, among others, read about Kabir Dehqanzahi, also a foreign citizen, but not from a government, not from a powerful government, a foreign citizen. He's from Pakistani Baluchistan. He went to Iran when he was 13, working as an assistant driver, arrested for drug trafficking, and he was executed in July 2017. And I would also like to give some attention to all the foreign citizens. There are, at the present moment, around 200 Pakistani citizens in Iranian prisons, many of them sentenced to death. Nobody follows them up, not even their own government. And there are many Afghan citizens who are being executed and also are in the Iranian prisons on the death row. So I hope that the attention we create here would also help all of them. I must also say that I'm really glad to see, especially Maryam here. You have done a tremendous job for Saeed, and I hope that all those thousands of prisoners in Iranian prisons, each of them would get a Maryam who could be their voices, because that's extremely important. What you can do as a family member, no human rights organization can do. So we will try to support you as much as we can, but keep up the good faith. Before ending this, I would like to draw your attention to what is the common feature of all these cases we have been hearing about the dual citizen, about all these confessions, what happens with the BBC journalists and all those on the death row. I think one of the main obstacles for improvement in the human rights situation in Iran is the lack of due process and rule of law. And I hope that Western governments, they will put that on the top of their agenda. Unless we get improvement in the Iranian judicial system, major reforms, fundamental reforms, the human rights situation will not get better, unfortunately. We might be able to save individuals, but there will always be new people who will fall into the hands of the same judiciary. So just one example of what is wrong with, what can be wrong with the Iranian judiciary. We have two individuals. One of them is Mahmoud Karimi. He, after a car incident in Tehran, he got out of his car and got into an argument with the other car, a young couple driving the other car, and he started shooting with his gun at the other car. The other individual with the names are a little bit similar, Ahmadreza Djalali, a young man charged with mugging and threatening a person with a knife They stopped the person on the street, threatened him with a knife, and stole his money, about, I think, $70. What happened to these two individuals? Alireza Karimia, who you see here in this picture, and it's in the Revolutionary Court of Tehran, and behind him you see a notorious judge, Salavati, who is involved in many of these cases you have heard about today. Alireza, just less than 4 weeks after he was arrested, he was sentenced to death and he was hanged publicly in front of the family. And you can see some of the family, they're crying in Tehran, just a few weeks after his arrest. For what? For using a knife to spread fear in the society. Mahmoud Karimi, who had used a gun shooting in the middle of the street, all charges were dropped against him. He was a religious singer in the inner circle of the Iranian supreme leader. It's the same judiciary who has treated these two individuals, and you see how different the treatment is. One of the main problems in the Iranian judiciary is that people are not equal. Some people are more equal than the others. And I think this is something that we should address. And also there are many other problems with the Iranian judiciary and revolutionary courts that I hope we address. So I just stop here and we can take the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. Cillian, if I can just come to you first. You showed us a horrific list of figures there, but what would you say are the main obstacles that stop you doing your job properly?
In this case?
Yes.
Ideally, when you're faced with a situation where there is a difficulty arising internationally and within a particular country, you should be in a position to take action within the individual country and then take action internationally, and to do that. So one of the obstacles that we have, obviously, is whether we can do anything effective within Iran, and then whether we can do anything effective internationally. So what we have done is we have tried to turn some of the obstacles that we faced into challenges which we can overcome. So a particular example, I can give a very recent example, which is relevant to many of the other cases, particularly after what you've just said. The concerns about human rights in Iran and lack of due process in Iran are emphasised by the establishment by the United Nations of a UN Special Rapporteur specifically focused on Iran, so Ahmadreza Djalali. And something which has been very much on our mind in the last few months was whether that was going to be renewed. Many of you will know in the room that Ahmadreza Djalali very sadly died very unexpectedly early this year. And a key obstacle was whether that was going to be continued, so whether the mandate for the Special Rapporteur was going to continue. And that's very important because it's a means for the international community to have oversight of Iran's human rights situation. And also, if the Special Rapporteur is not allowed to enter Iran to gather information, then that in itself sends an alarm signal to the international community. And when we didn't have that, we just had with the UN the Universal Periodic Review process, which is only every 3 years and has many limitations. So continuing the UN Special Rapporteur mandate was a particular obstacle, and I'm very pleased to say that that has been continued, and there is now an advertisement. There's going to be a new Special Rapporteur appointed, and that's going to be hugely important. I mean, you asked about the common thread running through all our cases, because the stories today have been quite disparate in some ways, but at the core of them is a violation of human rights and a failure to respect fundamental human rights. And it seems to me continuation of the UN Special Rapporteur's mandate is critical for all of us and for all of these cases. And that's an obstacle which has been overcome. There's one example.
Some of the stories that we've heard today, we've heard of torture, we've heard of false confessions, sham trials, lack of access to legal representation. Is there anything from a legal point of view that can be done to hold these people accountable?
So legally, internationally, yes. So Iran is subject to international standards and international norms. For those of you who do want more detail, I can give you a lot more detail on the series of violations that have occurred in Rana's case for all of BBC Persian, and indeed in the other cases that we've heard, where there have been violations of basic standards about freedom of expression, protection against arbitrary detention, right to freedom of assembly, right to access information, a whole range of things. And those breaches, you can be held to account internationally. And that's why the complaint to David Kay and Ahmadreza Djalali that we made is so important. But in many cases, complaints to those UN mechanisms can be critical. So if you're facing difficulties with using the legal mechanisms within the particular country, in this case Iran, you can use those international mechanisms. And there's many other examples internationally where that's worked effectively. So prisoners have been released from Egypt, from Equatorial Guinea, a range of places, in large part because of international pressure being brought to bear. And international pressure really is critical. And then there's obviously in individual cases potentially something you can do legally, internally. But we're very focused on the international mechanisms and what we can do legally. And that's something which is open to all of us in all of these cases. And it's not reliant on you being a dual national. So it's not reliant on you having a UK link to do it. So you can take a case for a citizen who is solely an Iranian citizen who's detained within Iran. You can take an international case in that way. And that is a mechanism which should be used more often, in my view, because it can be hugely effective.
What about Iranian human rights lawyers who are trying to defend people in the country, journalists, dual nationals, political activists? They are just fighting a losing battle, aren't they? Tell me about the kind of dangers that they would come up against.
So according to Iranian constitution, everybody is able to have a lawyer, and the lawyers are supposed to be able to defend them. But unfortunately, it's not the case, because being a lawyer, especially in security-related cases, it's a risky business. We have heard about several lawyers who have been sentenced to imprisonment solely because of defending someone, their client. And in the Iranian judicial system, it is possible to, there are vague charges such as spreading propaganda. Let's say if a lawyer defending someone talks to the media about his or her client, he can be actually charged with that and then get heavy sentences, like several years. We have lawyers who have been sentenced to 10 years in prison because of that. So that's a major problem in Iran, but also there are others, because on one side we have a constitution which actually is quite modern. It's with the international standards. The judiciary is supposed to be impartial, according to one of the articles of Iranian constitution, from 1950s. No confessions extracted under torture are valid. It is written in the Iranian constitutions. But then we see that confessions extracted under torture or pressure, it's very common. Dr. Ahmad Shahid, the previous special rapporteur, published a report showing that a large number of individuals they had talked to, they were either exposed to torture to get confessions, or they didn't have legal representations. And this includes all kinds of charges. But people we have been talked to, they are mainly death row prisoners. I can't recall a single death row prisoner who has not been subjected to torture to get confession. Not a single one. To solitary confinement. I don't recall of a single prisoner who has had access to lawyer during the investigation time. So, as you completely correctly said, a person who is sentenced by the Revolutionary Court, normally before the sentence is issued, is already late, because they base these sentences on confessions, very often solely on those confessions extracted under torture. And by the time the lawyer comes into the picture, there is nothing you can do, because there is already a confession.
I actually have the figures from Dr. Ahmad Shahid here. It says that 45% were not permitted to present information in their defence. 43% the trial lasted a matter of minutes. 70% of the interviews noted that coerced information or confessions had been used by the judge, and 65% reported that the judge displayed clear signs of bias. So that was in 2014, and as we know, nothing has changed now. In fact, I think the situation has significantly got worse. Is there any possibility of a fair trial in the revolutionary courts? Is it even a possibility?
So I very much agree with what you've said about the mismatch between the principle and practice. That you do have in the Constitution and indeed also in the Citizens' Charter these statements, aspirational statements, which seem very much in keeping with the rights that you have internationally. But then what you in fact have in practice is very, very different. And it is exceptionally difficult to see how any individual could have a fair trial in these circumstances. And that's one of the reasons why international pressure and international mechanisms are so important, because unlike having a trial in many other countries where you can be confident that you will have a fair trial, there are very, very profound concerns. And in those circumstances, you need to look at alternative mechanisms. But it's critical that you look carefully at how they may impact upon each other. And that's obviously something which individual cases people need to give thought to, because they don't want to make matters worse. So they need to exert pressure, but they need to do it in a strategic and targeted way. Could I say one other quick thing in light of what you just said? You mentioned about lawyers. And there are many examples. I mean, many of you in the room will have heard the very powerful words of Shireen Ebadi, who's actually an associate at my chambers, who's a lawyer, got the Nobel Peace Prize, and as a lawyer was targeted because of the work she was doing for her clients. And there is that correlation between a lawyer and their client, and assuming they're one of the same. And that's very similar to the issue that a lot of the journalists are facing as well. I mean, Maziar Bahari, whose name came up earlier, describes how when he was jailed, he says they said to him, well, a spy gathers information, asks questions, gets paid for doing it. And what do? You're a journalist, you're a spy, you're the same. And there's a perception that the two jobs are one and the same. And many lawyers who we work with in Iran, including lawyers who were in Iran and have now left, describe a very similar mindset, a mindset that if you're working as a defense lawyer and you're working with people who are accused of terrorism or these other offenses against the state, that you are also sullied by that. And that's a very pernicious, dangerous approach. As from an Irish background, we've seen what that can do in an Irish context. But there is very much an idea that the lawyer and the client are one and the same, rather like the blurring of the line between the journalist and the story they're reporting.
I just add to what, also to your question. I think I'm not, I'm actually optimistic because we know that international pressure helps. If the political costs of Iran's actions are high enough, Iranian authorities are actually pragmatic. They will back off. And the other part is that inside Iran, we have a pretty large civil society, although they are under pressure, but we see that they don't give up. We have lawyers who are doing their best to make any improvement possible within the framework of the system. We have people with, who are, you have seen probably their pictures with civil disobedience. And so I think that having a sustainable international pressure or backing of the Iranian civil society might actually give positive results. So raising the political cost of these actions is important.
According to the Islamic Penal Code, confessions or testimonies by eyewitnesses that are missing, the judge can make the decision himself based on his exclusive opinion without any reference to law whatsoever. And we know that this is a loophole that has been used many times to target dual nationals and journalists. There really is no hope of a fair trial at all, really, is there, with these obstacles in the way?
Yeah, I mean, well, there are certain institutions which needs to be removed if you really want to have a, I mean, if you are talking about rule of law, we need to do fundamental changes in Iran. I mean, head of the judiciary is appointed by country's highest political power. And it's not only a formality. Actually, they choose the person or dismiss based on religious belief, political belief, and also background. So the head of judiciary appoints the judges, again, based on their political and religious belief. Only men who believe in a certain part of the Shiite Islam can be judges, and that's not enough, but they should also show a background, what have they been doing for the Islamic Republic. So Iranian judiciary at the present moment is not a judicial system, it's a political organ. And the aim is not working, for justice, but it's to promote the interests of the Islamic Republic. So if that kind of fair, due process you're talking about, we need to do fundamental changes, but we can do smaller changes also within the framework of the system if the international pressure is high enough and also if we support civil society inside the country.
Rana, if I could come to you for a final question before we take some questions from the audience. As a dual national, you lived in Iran for many years, you covered many high-profile stories, so you've seen things from both sides. What do you think the future holds for relations between the West and Iran going forward?
Well, I think with the way things are going and the rhetoric from the Americans and Saudi Arabia and Israel, things are not looking great. Neither for Iran nor for the region. So I think many people inside Iran and observers, they're deeply worried. And I think if the political arena goes in the bad way, it's not going to have a good effect on the civil society as well. Because when the regime feels under threat, defensive, paranoid, it's going to clamp down on the civil society even more than before.
Ladies and gentlemen, does anybody have any questions they'd like to put to our panel? Yes, sir.
Why do you think that the government is so scared of civil society in Iran? Like, why do you think they have such a distrust of civil society movements and people calling for change from within? And do you think this is related to the color revolutions that took place in Eastern Europe, in the post-Soviet states? Or do they see this as the threat, i.e. with civil society movements being used by other countries to subvert them? Is that the fear that they use, and is that why they crack down on civil society in Iran?
Shiva, if I can put that question to you, please.
Well, if I may remind everyone, Islamic government hijacked the revolution. The revolution wasn't supposed to be having this government. So from the day one, since I was 10 years old, I've opened my eyes, they've been killing people. So the threat, they see people in Iran as a threat. But then as it goes along, in 80s, they used to be more organized in political parties. And they had that mass killing in summer 1988. But then as it went along, I think young people, this generation, become very vocal. And everything in Iran becomes political, because being an environmental activist, being an animal activist, because, having dog is haram, basically, if you have it. So what I'm trying to say, you're saying why they're scared, because they're scared of being overthrown every time. You guys remember in January that in 90 cities of Iran, there were demonstrations. So they are scared of every single activist, because they know that if you're a homosexual, if you're a women's rights activist, anything you are threatening the Islamic regime. And therefore, they defend themselves, obviously. We talked about the reform. The Islamic regime is not reformable. They hijacked the revolution. They came for a mission to establish Islamic regime in Iran and in the Middle East, actually, promoting it. So therefore, they're doing their job. They don't do anything now. No dictatorship in their constitution said, I'm going to kill anyone who practices their freedom of expression. So what I'm trying to say, everything in Iran, they see it as a threat. Recently, we noticed that girls of Revolution Street, they pick up their scarf, women who doesn't want Islamic dress code. That's a threat to them as well. Anything that kind of threat their existence, they're going to be smashed, basically.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, that brings us over. Okay, we can just squeeze one more in.
I have a question from Ms. Malekpour. You tried to inform the world about your family situation for around 10 years. Would you please describe us how international pressure can affect on possibly have been effective so far? Has it been effective in any way?
I have to go back because when they showed Saeed's confession in TV, they show it for a year, almost a year. So I tried for 2 years to humanize my brother's face, to show that he's the person that we're talking about. It was my sort of campaign, and after that, people could hear my voice. like I had issue. I couldn't find like any, Iran. It was hard for Iranian to find like Iranian media to talk about Saeed's case, because like the charges that he was sentenced to, it was like moderating pornographic website. So like it was hard like for me to connect with Iranian media, but it started as I said, but with the help of some human rights activists, I could get attentions from governments, from like different governments. I remember I think it was in 2013 or 14 that European government, I think it was England, it was France, and some other countries, that they spoke up about Saeed's case. And it was the Canadian government that they brought up Saeed's case. And it definitely helped. It definitely helped. And another thing that I never mentioned before, like Saeed, as I said, Saeed was in solitary confinement for 5 years. I did everything to could transfer him from solitary confinement to general ward. It didn't happen. We had a huge tooth storm. I think it was 5 years ago. So we got lots of a huge attention. And then I received a phone call from Foreign Minister's office, the Canadian Foreign Minister's office. They told me they're gonna have a discussion behind the scenes with Iranian government about Saeed's case. They asked for my permission. So I said, go ahead, you don't need to ask me. And then 2 days after, Saeed was transferred to general ward. And he said, he called me, in that time, I hadn't heard his voice for 2 years. And he called me and said, what you did? I'm like, what do you mean? So why did you call me? I was shocked. I thought something happening to him. And he said they were so nice to me and they transferred me to general ward. So it could happen. That's why I'm saying, I'm asking Canadian government, because if they put more pressure on the Iranian government, it could happen.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, I'm sorry, but we really do have to end the event there. Thank you very much for joining us as we put the spotlight on Iran. You can keep up to date on the IOHR website. I'd like to thank our panel. Thank you and good evening. Thank you.